과학이 모든 걸 설명할 수 있느냐는 질문에 영국의 저명한 화학자 피터 에킨스가 답합니다.
Yes, of course it hasn't yet explained everything, but there are no signs that it's going to run up against a brick wall and stop explaining everything. First of all, be clear what we mean by science, and science is basically a method of discovery based on observation and taking evidence that can be shared publicly and generally, and that is really the core of the scientific method. Science deals with questions for which there is evidence, whereas a typical religious question might be, what is the purpose of the universe? Science can dismiss that as an irrelevant question. There is no evidence that there is any purpose in the universe. So when you ask questions for which there is no evidence, such as what is the purpose of the universe, what is the nature of the afterlife, and all that sort of thing, science need not trouble to try to answer them because they're nonsense questions. Science deals with real questions, questions for which there is evidence.
이어 천재 수학자라 불리는 존 레녹스에게도 동일한 질문이 주어지죠.
Well, obviously not. Brexit, for example. You're going to be surprised at how much I agree with Peter, because the definition of science he offered us, that is collecting evidence, making observations, in fact in his book on being, he reduces it beautifully to making observations and comparing notes. If that's what we mean by science, and it's the old meaning of science before the 19th century, then of course science can explain everything, because the very word explanation means making evidence-based observations and notes. So my short answer is, if we accept Peter's first definition, then I agree with him entirely. Science, by definition, explains everything. But of course, the meaning of the word science has changed in England, but not on the continent. In German, Wissenschaft covers the humanities and the natural sciences. And when people these days say science can explain everything, they're not referring simply to making observations and comparing notes at all. For instance, that would apply to any historical or forensic examination. And my faith as a Christian is based precisely on the kind of scientific reasoning that Peter has set forward to us. The main issue, I think, in discussion today is not whether that kind of evidence-based thinking and observation can come to every conclusion. Let me just say, by the way, that from the Christian perspective, Luke, the writer of the third gospel, tells us that that is exactly what his method was. He consulted people, he made observations, and then he put them together. So we'll call that science one. What is, of course, at stake today is the question, can the natural sciences answer every question? And there I think that is simply not the case. The Nobel Prize winner Peter Medawar, many years ago, he wrote a very interesting book on the limits of science. And he said, we do science a disservice, natural science, if we think it can address any questions. And every question. And he referred to the basic questions of Karl Popper, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? Natural science doesn't answer questions like that. And Medawar added it is to religion, philosophy, and so on that we must go to answer those questions. I think science is immensely powerful. It is immensely exciting, and it uncovers a vast amount about our universe. But I have a problem by going too far. I'm a mathematician and I'm rather interested in logic. And you know, if we say that science can explain everything, or science is the only way to truth, as it's often put, well, that is not a statement of science. It's a statement of belief. And so if it's true, it's false. Maybe it's too early in the evening for logic like that, but there's a huge logical problem. To sum up my position, science is powerful, powerful. Its methodologies are extremely important also in the sphere of history, forensic science, and in the sphere of religion. But I'm going to be careful here, because Peter is right very often in his critique of superstition, of mythology, and nonsense. And science has helped to clear away some of the nonsensical things that sometimes religious people profess. But what really makes me, in one sense, very much in favor of the Christian faith is that from the very start it claims to be evidence-based. And the central piece of evidence is, of course, as you probably know, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I believe in Peter's methodology. I use it all the time, but somehow he feels that a Christian like me doesn't use that methodology within my own Christian faith. Final point, I think explanation. Can science explain everything? We need to tease out what we mean by the word explanation. For example, the law of gravity doesn't explain gravity. It tells, as Newton realized, it tells us wonderful mathematics that we can calculate the way in which heavy bodies move in relationship to one another. But even when we say science explains, often it doesn't explain comprehensively. And I just want to throw a very simple analogy into this, which I find quite useful. About boiling water. How would you explain boiling water? Well, you can explain it by talking about heat conduction and agitation of molecules of water. You can also say the water is boiling because I'd like a cup of tea. Now, those two explanations are very different. They don't conflict. They complement. One is a scientific explanation, natural scientific, but the other is an explanation in terms of the intention and purposes of an agent. And Peter said quite clearly that science doesn't go in for that kind of purpose, but that doesn't mean that kind of purpose doesn't exist. In fact, people have been enjoying tea for millennia before they knew anything about the theory of heat in physics. So what I want to say is this: the God explanation is different from the science explanation. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with physics as an explanation of the motor car.
그러자 곧바로 피터가 반응하죠.
Well, there's so much nonsense to hack away from resurrection of Jesus. Never happened. I mean,
Well, that's an assertion, Peter. What about some evidence?
well, what about some evidence that it did happen, other than people who are writing Gospels of 80 years later than the event that they purport to be talking about? No, of course it didn't happen. How could it happen? And science, I think, could even go so far as saying it simply could not happen. When you've got a dead body, it's decaying straight away. There's no way that it's going to reconstitute in some way. It's absurd. I accept it is the foundation of Christian faith. That doesn't mean to say that it's true. Let's dismiss that as something that simply has no evidence whatsoever.
곧 존 레녹스가 설명합니다.
Science proceeds on discovering the regularities to which nature works and has done a very impressive job. And the fact that we know that dead bodies don't normally rise, that is a law of nature in that sense, means that we recognize something very special happened, if it did happen. Now, there are two issues here. The first of all, there's the in-principle one, which always ends up in talking about David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and I do not believe they are. That's point number one, and I can go into that if you like.
Well, you better define a miracle. I think a miracle is defined as something that is against the laws of nature.
But I don't define it like that at all. A miracle, miraculum in Latin simply means something to be wondered at, but we're talking about something supernatural. It seems to be very clear that when Hume said miracles violate the laws of nature, he was really not understanding. And the great interpreter Anthony Flew of David Hume.
No.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
C.S. Lewis long ago told a little analogy. If I stay in a hotel tonight, put £100 in a drawer, and do the same tomorrow night, there are £200 in it. 1 + 1 = 2. If on the third morning I find 50 quid, what do I say? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? Clearly, I say the laws of England have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's our recognizing of what normally happens that helps us to see an exception. Now, if I were claiming that the body of Jesus rose from the dead by processes, natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before we happened, yes, that would be wrong. But I'm not claiming that. What Christians claim is that the God that created the universe and built the regularities
Pure
into
speculation.
it is capable.
Pure speculation.
Wait a minute. No, this is
not worth listening
this
to.
isn't speculation. Well,
Let's listen and then you respond, Peter.
Peter, it's dead easy to say it's not worth listening to. You tempt me to say that about some of the things you say, but I'm not going to do that because it seems to me it's very important to listen to what Christianity claims before you judge it. And what is claimed is the God who creates the universe and sustains it is not subject to laws as if they were laws of a land. He set up the regularities and he can feed a new event into them. And the claim is, and with this I finish, that God raised Christ from the dead by an input of colossal power.
Oh, Jesus.
Well, you've got it, Peter, in one.
I mean, this is, everyone knows here that's nonsense. What you're inventing is an agent who can do anything he likes. It is the laziest way of accounting for observations, sometimes observations that were never actually made. Religious explanations which resort to God did it, intellectually lazy. I won't use a stronger term than that, but I do think that they are lazy because, I mean, what does it mean as an explanation? You lie there saying, oh, God did it. And everyone said, oh, I understand now. Religious explanations is easy to accept by the unthinking. Science is difficult to accept because it involves a lot of thought. You really have to tease out the processes by which an event occurs. You can't simply say, and God did it. You've got to go through, in biology, you delve down into, if you like, the chemistry of the organism. In chemistry, you delve down into the physics of the underlying processes. And I accept maybe in physics you have to delve down into the underlying mathematical fabric of whatever I mean by that. It's jolly hard work and you've got to work on it, but it's more satisfying when you get to the end of an explanation than that extraordinarily lazy way of pretending to explain by saying, and abracadabra, God did it. I mean, that is intellectually corrupt.
But Peter, that's confusing two different kinds of explanations.
Yes, indeed.
If you were to say about a motor car, Henry Ford did it, and that's all you had to say, then I would agree with you. But the point is, as I sit here and read your books and explaining chemistry and all this kind of thing, I say this is wonderful. This is not contradicting the God explanation, because the God explanation is saying that you, as a chemist, only have a universe to study because God created it in the first place. But he's not competing. In fact, interestingly, and this has always been a bit of a mandate for me, the very early chapters of the Genesis, God commands human beings to name the animals. He starts off taxonomy, which is the basic intellectual discipline. In other words, he said, you go and do science, and you'll find it utterly fascinating. So I think you're arguing at a straw God.
You don't know whether God was starting off science. He might have got so bored with his creation that he wanted to amuse them. And so
Who's speculating now?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, okay.
I think any speculation that uses the word God is intellectually corrupt. There is no God.
Can I?
No, be quiet. There is not one jot of evidence for God.
Oh, I think there's a
Only in
lot of
lazy
evidence
minds
for
is there
God.
evidence for God.
거기에 이런 말도 덧붙이죠.
Trouble is, the philosophers are pessimists, basically, because they get paid to doubt, and they doubt the capacity of human understanding. Scientists are optimists. They think that given time, given collaboration, hugely important, they will arrive at explanations that do not require the insertion of words like God. God is no more than a word, frankly, which is used to disguise the inability to comprehend something. God is also a great motivation for art.
Yes.
Wonderful pictures, wonderful music, wonderful literature, all induced by belief in God. But it doesn't mean that God actually exists. It simply means that you believe that he exists.
The point is, it doesn't show it's false. And your little comment there was they all believed in God in those days is also false, because it's very interesting when you think of the rise of modern science in Western Europe. I've mentioned that. The reason we can do science is the God who created the universe also stands behind the human mind. That makes much more sense.
그러나 피터는 증거에 더욱
There's
몰두합니다.
no evidence that there is any purpose in the universe. You've got to look for evidence. The real questions are based on evidence. The silly questions, the fake questions, if you like, are based on extrapolations of human experience, if you like. So we have purposes. I have a purpose for coming here this evening, though I must confess I forget what it was.
So you believe in purpose but not ultimate purpose, is that it?
Well, I believe that people have individual, temporary, ephemeral purposes. That's fine. For there to be a purpose in the universe is an extrapolation of that attitude. There is no evidence that the universe has a purpose at all. So it's inappropriate for science to do a series of experiments to discover the purpose.
Well, when you say there's no evidence, I would go back to the fact, I must, in that sense, come back to my Christian faith. Christianity is not a mere philosophy. It's geared into history. It seems to me that the whole initial explanation, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that starts off a huge meta-narrative that gives human beings huge significance as made in the image of God. Now, that may be true or it may be false, but does it make sense? It's not one of these nonsense things. It certainly makes a great deal of sense. And incidentally, some of the brightest minds in history have spent years thinking about these things.
I've just read through Anthony Kenner's Modern History of Western.
Yes.
A great 1,000-page.
Yeah, I know.
brick.
I've read it too.
900 of those pages show what a waste of time philosophy was when people were worrying about the nature of God and his philosophy. Just famous St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, you name them, completely wasted their lives by thinking about non-questions. It's only when...
But that's your belief, Peter.
Yeah, but there's no evidence for God is the basis of that's the core of my belief. That's what we're talking about. There is no evidence for God. That is the rock on which I build my system of explanations. Your rock is a kind of elaboration of that, because this physiologically unlikely event of the resurrection.
The rock in my life is, I'm looking for a worldview, and you have a worldview, it's atheism, and I have a worldview that is Christian, that makes sense of life and gives me a meta-narrative big enough to live for and live in. Now, we've been talking tonight all up to this time about science and evidence that might come from the natural world. I believe that the natural world, with its laws that Peter writes about brilliantly, and I envy him his ability, those very laws are indicators, to my mind, of a divine mind. The fact that at the heart of biology is the longest word we've ever discovered, the genetic code, is again consistent that this universe is a word-based universe. In the beginning was the Word. All things were made by him. So I see evidence of rational intelligence all over science, but I see that the alternative worldview, atheism, undermines that, although it perceives the very same rational intelligence. Explanatory power at that level. But you see, I did say Christianity is not merely a philosophy. And if Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, then that opens up huge possibilities of personal encounter in my life now. And the major reason why I believe that Christianity is true is because, and here comes science again as a base, because Christianity is testable.
Oh, nonsense. How can it be tested?
Well, Peter, let me face that head on. Christ said when he was on earth.
Didn't, but go ahead.
Christ said that if a person considered the evidence and came to believe that he was God incarnate, who was dying on a cross to give forgiveness and bring peace with God, well, we can test that. I've tested it. And I've seen hundreds of people test it. I mean, take an example. I was lecturing at Harvard a while ago to a couple of thousand people. And when I'd finished, a young Chinese student stood up and he said, "Look at me." So we looked at him. And I said, "Why should we look at you?" He was absolutely beaming. He said, "You should look at me because 6 months ago I came to a lecture you gave at Penn State University. I was at the end. My life was in a complete mess. And something you said triggered a search. And I started to read the New Testament for myself and I became a Christian. And just look at me now." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that happen not once, not twice, dozens of times. And when you see addiction to drugs transformed into food on the table, when you see broken relationships mended, and you ask people, "What happened to you?" and they say variously, "I became a Christian, I had an encounter with Christ," you begin to put 2 and 2 together and make 4. And I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that these promises that Jesus made actually can be fulfilled in a person's life today. That's immensely important to me, the testability of Christian relationship with God.
It's a kind of testability that you should leave to the psychologists and the psychiatrists, I think.
But I don't mind the psychiatrists. What do you mean, leave it to them?
Well,
The
because they will understand why these people have found the comfort. Let's accept that it may be comfort.
But that doesn't prove it's wrong, Peter, to use your argument. The fact that Christianity brings comfort is not evidence against it. It may well be evidence for it. If it brought discomfort and ruined people's
it's brought
lives...
a great deal of discomfort. Ask Joan of Arc, for example.
You're raising another question, and I'm Irish. I'm very sensitive to that question. And I can go into it if you want to.
그리고 결정적인 질문이 날아오죠.
Why would God create atheists?
He wouldn't create atheists. God creates human beings in that sense, in his image. And Peter's is created in God's image as I am.
God help God.
And his rationality and his science and all the rest of it is just an example of the marvelous things that God builds into people. People choose to be atheists. You see, it's a worldview, it's a faith system. I believe in God. Christianity is my worldview. Naturalism is Peter's worldview. He believes it. So the real issue is this: what worldview do we believe in? And that's why we have evenings like this to try to present the evidence on both sides, which we have tried to do, so that you can make up your mind. But to say that God creates atheists is a deterministic belief that I reject. And I feel quite strongly about this, that the wonderful thing about the way in which we're made as human beings is God loves us enough to give us real responsibility so that our decisions and our moral choices are full of meaning. If you say God creates Christians or atheists, you end up with a kind of robotic situation where we're simply puppets on a string. And I don't think that accords in any way with the God who reveals himself in Christ.
마지막으로 피터가 말합니다.
Can't be rational and a Christian.
Right. Any response, John? The gloves are off.
Yes, Peter, yes, I have a response. What do you say to a Nobel Prize winning physicist who's a Christian?
Grow up.
Well, Between 1900 and 2000, 65% of Nobel Prize winners were Christian.
이 피터라는 저명한 화학자가 교만한 무신론적 지성의 전형이라는 점은 잠시 접어두더라도 불과 7년 전의 영상이지만 돌이켜보면 이처럼 극렬한 무신론자가 존재하는 사회가 영적으로 더 건강할 수도 있다는 견해도 있습니다. 초대 교부 터툴리안이 순교자의 피는 교회의 씨앗이라 말했고 현대사회학자 로드니 스타크도 박해가 신앙 공동체를 단련한다고 분석합니다. 초대교회도 그랬듯 박해가 있을 때 교회는 더욱 선명한 정체성과 믿음을 드러냈으니까요. 지금은 영성과 기독교라는 표현이 흔해졌지만 정작 하나님과 인격적으로 교제하는 뜨거운 신앙 대신 철학적 담론 수준에 머무는 경우가 많습니다. 적극적 무신론자가 점점 줄어들고 기독교가 좋지도 싫지도 않은 문화 코드로만 소비될 때 그 미지근함 속의 부흥이 오히려 더 큰 위험 신호일 수도 있다는 것이죠. 마치 중세시대 교회가 복음을 독점하며 진정한 영성이 아닌 정치, 사회, 경제적 도구로 전락했던 것처럼 결국 시대와 세대가 어떻게 변하든 저런 무신론적 지성이 불편해할 만큼 직격으로 다가서는 사회가 오히려 복음이 더 멀리 퍼지기 좋은 토양이 됩니다. 이를 위해서는 아무것도 두려워하지 않는 언약 위에 단단히 선 심장이 필요합니다. 증언의 어원이 순교이듯 목숨까지 내어놓을 각오가 반드시 따라야 하죠. 그것이 곧 무수한 무신론적 지성으로 가득한 옥스퍼드 한복판에서 화려한 수사나 지적 과시가 아니라 십자가 복음 그 자체를 선포한 존 레녹스의 길이었습니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe in God. I believe in the supernatural God who created the heavens and the earth. I believe in a God who holds the heavens and the earth in existence. I believe that on the basis of rational evidence, similar to the beliefs held by the founders of this house, who gave this university the motto Dominus Illuminatio Mea. They saw no contradiction between faith in God and the utmost excellence in rational inquiry. And if I dare mention my alma mater of Cambridge in this holy place, I would remind you that on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge are written the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." And as we look at the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, Alfred North Whitehead and many others commented that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave my subject. What I am amazed at is that serious thinkers today continue to ask us to choose between God and science. That's like asking people to choose between Henry Ford and engineering as an explanation of the motor car. When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, "I've got a law, I don't need God." No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the greatest work in the whole history of science, because he saw that God is not the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. God doesn't compete. Agency does not compete with mechanism and law. Why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, the brilliant cosmologist who became a Christian in his 50s, said God is the answer to that question. But people are now so desperate to show that the universe created itself from nothing, which seems to me to be an immediate oxymoron. If I say X created Y, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X created X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists utter it. It reminds me a little bit of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "It is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything." The heavens declare the glory of God, says the ancient psalm. And we've unraveled a bit of that, seeing the fine-tuning of the fundamental forces of nature. It's something that's so striking to scientists that it demands explanation. And it seems to me that Arno Penzias hit it right. He is the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the microwave background on which a lot of the evidence for the Big Bang is based. He said astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. But I want to come to what I think is one of the fundamental arguments for theism. I take it this house believes in reason. That's why we're all here. And as a scientist, I believe that the universe is rationally intelligible. That is something that has struck some of the geniuses of science as demanding an explanation. Einstein said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And Wigner talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematician thinking in her head in here can come up with equations that seem to fit the universe out there? Well, how is it indeed? Because the irony of the atheist position here is evident. My atheist friends, and I have many of them, tell me that the driving force of evolution, which eventually produced our human cognitive faculties, reason included, was not primarily concerned with truth at all, but with survival. And we all know, ladies and gentlemen, what has often happened and still happens to truth when individuals or commercial enterprises or nations feel themselves threatened and struggle for survival. Leading philosopher Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame says if atheists are right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then they have given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including their atheism. Their biology and their belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Yet my atheist friends still insist that it is rational for them to believe that the evolution of human reason was not directed for the purpose of discovering truth. And yet it is irrational for me to believe that human reason was designed and created by God to enable us to understand and believe the truth. Curious logic. By contrast with that, biblical theism asserts that ultimate reality is personal and intelligent, and the reason science works, and this was the motivating force that drove the great pioneers of science, is that the universe out there and the human mind in here that does the science are ultimately the product of the same intelligent divine mind. Human beings are made, we are told, in God's image, and that means that science can be done. That makes infinitely more sense to me as a scientist than atheism does. Now let me come briefly to ethics. Ethical behavior, like rational behavior, of course, does not itself require religious belief. This is consistent with the fact that humans are created in God's image as rational moral persons. But just as I suggest that rationality cannot be explained without the existence of God, so I dare to suggest that the existence of morality cannot be explained either. As modern science sprang from Judeo-Christian sources, so did the concept of human equality. Listen to atheist Jürgen Habermas, arguably one of Germany's leading intellectuals. He said that universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life and solidarity, the individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there's no alternative to it. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. And it seems to me he's hitting the core of something important, because the value of a human being on which such egalitarianism rests is based not on what the human being can do, but what she's made of, or how she's made in God's image. I never forget speaking on one of my many visits to Russia to a colleague in the Academy of Sciences. And he said, "You know, John, we thought we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings. We found we couldn't, and we've murdered millions of them." And Alexander Solzhenitsyn has said, "If I'm asked, why is it that 60 million of my fellow countrymen were sacrificed?" He said, the answer is, we have forgotten God. Science, of course, marvelous as it is limited. Even a Nobel Prize winner, by analysing a cake, cannot tell why it was made. But Aunt Matilda, who made it, can tell you. She can reveal it to you. But if she doesn't reveal it to you, you'll never know. And that brings me to my next evidence. It's the same with the universe. We can analyse it magnificently. But ultimately, if it has a maker, and I believe it has, only he can tell us what it's all about. And he's done so in the powerful narrative of the Bible, in particular in its analysis of the problem with humanity, not simply in terms of behavioral breakdown between people, but a vertical breakdown of trust between us and the Creator. The unique solution to that problem is not simply in terms of human ethical development, although that's very important, but in terms of something far deeper altogether. The restoration of the fractured relationship with God through the salvation he has brought through Jesus Christ. A radical relationship that empowers us to live ethically from God. And here we reach what for me is the chief evidence, not only for the existence but the nature of God. It is Jesus Christ. He it was who not only taught the golden rule, but embodied it, fed the hungry, healed the sick and suffering, and welcomed society's outcasts, brought honor and respect to the marginalized and ashamed. And he's brought forgiveness and peace to multi-millions around the world. He's able to do this, of course, because though he was a man, he uniquely never was only a man, but God become human. The central evidence for this startling claim is, of course, his historical resurrection from the dead that launched Christianity in the world. This is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, a crunch issue. If Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the end and atheism is false. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. And I remember at Cambridge as a student listening to the brilliant Sir Norman Anderson, a legal expert, going through forensically the evidence from his legal perspective as a brilliant lawyer. And he said at the end of it, the empty tomb then of Jesus forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain. Just finally now, as I read the Bible, I do not only find intellectual satisfaction, but I find a great deal of that. I sense the voice of God speaking to me. You say, that's intensely personal. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked tonight about belief in God. And I want to strongly emphasize that God is not a theory, he's a person. And if the origination of me qua person is a personal God, then the most exciting thing really is there a possibility of getting to know God? And so I don't simply believe there is a God. I've come to know him and trust him. And I have strong reasons for doing so, because of Christ dying and rising again for me. And that has generated in me a sense of utterly unmerited forgiveness, acceptance, and peace. That has enabled me to face the ugly side of my own nature, and with God's help to do something about it. But it's enabled me to face something else. The hardest problem I face as a Christian is the problem of evil and pain. My niece getting a tumor at 22 that kills her. What do I say to my sister? And this is the hardest problem we face. But it seems to me that atheism here has no answer, because by definition, atheism believes that human death is the end, so there is no ultimate hope. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, we could stay here till midnight and beyond arguing, as has been done in this university for centuries, what a good God should, might, would, could, if not possibly might, just could he not have done, and we'll get nowhere. So it seems to me there's another question we can ask, and it's this. Granted that life presents us with a double picture. We see some beautiful things. We see some ragged edges. We see hurt and pain, and we see joy. How can we come to terms with that? And it seems to me here is no simplistic answer, but a window into an answer, and it's this. If it is actually true that Jesus is, as I believe him to be, the Son of God, then we can ask the question, what is God doing on a cross? And the answer comes back at the very least. God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but has become part of it. And the other side of that is this: because Jesus rose from the dead, he is going to be the ultimate judge. Now here's an irony, because atheism has no ultimate hope of justice by definition. The vast majority of people in the history of the world have died without justice and will die without justice. And if death is the end, then of course they have no hope of ultimate justice. But the promise in the New Testament, guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus, is that he is to be the judge in the coming day. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the reasons why I believe that God is real and worthy to be trusted. Thank you.
복음은 심장을 겨누는 칼입니다. 가족과 친구의 사이를 가르고 세상의 쾌락과 마비된 평안을 잘라내는 날카롭고도 뜨거운 칼날입니다. 실제로 존 레녹스가 옥스퍼드의 한복판에서 자기 자신조차 최고의 지성임에도 그런 복음의 칼날을 내뱉었을 때 청중은 의아해하면서도 힘들어했죠. 그것이 복음입니다. 복음은 환희와 경멸로 나뉩니다. 아직도 세상과 나를 붙잡고 있는 자들에게는, 특히나 그것이 세속적인 지위와 자신의 능력으로 의지하는 사람일수록 신이 자신을 구원했다는 것을 인정하고 싶지 않아 자기 힘으로 이뤄냈다는 보상심리와 공로주의 때문에 복음을 경멸할 수밖에 없습니다. 그것이 바로 삶의 주인과 잣대를 온전히 자기 중심으로 두고 싶은 우리의 죄성이기 때문이죠. 그럼에도 우리는 순교를 각오해야 합니다. 그 기쁨에 젖어 살아야 합니다. 존 레녹스와도 같이 저명하고도 뛰어난 능력과 지혜를 가지고서도 그 한복판에서 전해야 합니다. 왜냐하면 우리의 소명은 우리의 일이나 커리어가 아니라 우리의 정체성 그 자체이기 때문이죠. 미래의 복음을 위한 갈고닦음이 아니라 당장 오늘을 조금 더 예수님과 동행하며 닮아가는 삶이기 때문이죠. 우리의 일상이 복음이며 우리가 주님 안에서 그 자체로 복인 것처럼 때로는 고난과 핍박을 무릅쓰고서라도 우리의 십자가를 들고 부활의 복음을 담대히 전하는 저와 여러분이 되었으면 좋겠습니다.
Hello everyone watching and listening. Today I'm speaking with Dr. John Lennox.
Pleasure, a pleasure.